Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is October 11th, 2019. Tonight, the global disruption machine finds Canada not like the rest. Yet, a global disruption machine has been roaming the globe for some time now, seeking political upheaval and piles of transitory revenue. It's been rolling along without effective countermeasures. Until Canada. Familiar tactics and methodology have not yielded the same results to date. A level of political party collusion, be it temporary or strategic, has appeared in Canada like never before. Grievances have always existed between the provinces and Ottawa, but now they are being manufactured and sold as critical national issues, with only partisan aims. Now, with the vectors tonight in what we're going to demonstrate, the political collusion factor is up to yours truly, your host. Quite happy to do that. Now, the next common vector of systemic disruption involves corporate media masquerading as journalism. Opinion's always been a big part of ownership, to be tolerated. But what's new is the misinformation, gaslighting, clickbaiting, and blind political preference without shame. Now, behavioral scientist and independent journalist Caroline Orr joins us. Welcome to the show, Caroline.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, it's fantastic to have you on the show for this little roundtable to look at the different factors that contribute to the bigger picture of disruption in institutions and systems. What can you tell us about where you're going to take us tonight, in your line of work? You've been working for the National Observer here in Canada, specifically to look at our election. I'm sure you found some interesting things, but I'm sure you find some common things too. Can you give us a little idea of where you're going to take us?
Yeah, so I think we'll talk a little bit about how the Canadian media ecosystem has in some ways come to mirror the system in the U.S. and some of the factors that maybe you're getting from us that we're sending up north, and also some of the ways that the Canadian ecosystem is different. One of the big things that I think may explain why that global disruption machine has not had the same effect in Canada is that Canadians actually still trust traditional news organizations and journalism. So that global disruption machine maybe hasn't had quite the impact that some of the operators would have wished. Of course, it doesn't mean it won't have the same impact, but thus far has not. And also talking a little bit about some of the new faces in media that have popped up in Canada and in the U.S. and how that has kind of contributed and helped that global disruption machine by giving a facade of journalism to what is not what most of us would consider journalism.
And just for a little bit of a spoiler, are you finding that the disruption machine is a little confused about why Canada isn't behaving just like everybody else?
I think so. So if you look at the recent story about, now there's a second one that they're trying to push about Trudeau, but there was a story about Trudeau in brownface that I'm sure by now we are all familiar with. And it landed and it took hold, but it didn't stay in the news cycle. And I think that was a surprise to a lot of people that it didn't dominate the news cycle beyond a couple days, and then it kind of went away. People are still talking about some of the actual issues, which I think is good, but there are legitimate issues beneath that story. But I think it didn't land with quite the thud that some were hoping, and it didn't take off in some of these real partisan circles into the mainstream, like you've seen in the U.S., where a story kind of gets its legs and keeps going for weeks. So, yeah.
Yeah, I do see that as a real difference with Canadian media to this point. But the most dangerous vector in this game is ahead of the curve. They are the curve. Big data owns the disruption game. Now, psychometrics, AI analytics, micro-targeting, and stealth are remaking the landscape. And NetWar Systems specializes in big data methods with regard to digital ecosystems. With insight, experience, skill, and advanced tools, they have unlocked insights around political narratives in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and Germany. The NetWar Systems also identifies disinformation campaigns, botnets, and other nefarious activities. And they have found evidence of such in Canada. Now, first, Neil Rawhauser. Welcome to the show, Neil.
Oh, good to be back.
It's good to have you back, sir. And for the first time, Jessalyn Hernandez joins us to explain your findings and provide context about the situation. Welcome to the show, Jess.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's good to have you guys here. Now, of course, people can assume you're going to be looking at more at the data side and the methods used to spread information, to create circles of like messaging that may not be legitimate. Could you give us some hints on what you guys are going to bring to the table tonight?
Well, with these tools, we've been able to discover some botnets, some disinformation campaigns, and really being able to dig into the metadata of Twitter. We found the sources and the applications used to push some of these narratives. And having this, deep view of this data has helped us really, unlock these insights in this data and guide us to understand what the global disinformation machine is trying to do in different places around the world.
And of course, this is a common pattern we're seeing for methods of creating echo chambers. Is it not? It's not. There's nothing unique going on in Canada, is there?
I wouldn't say so. Where we're seeing changes is how these botnets and methods are having to adapt to new changes. Twitter's hired an outside security firm and integrated them. So we've seen a lot of botnets and kind of sketchy accounts drop off because of them. But in regards to responding, their methods are changing a bit. So they're doing a better job at hiding, but the methods and the tactics are still the same.
Neil, what are you going to bring for us?
Well, I have been listening to Caroline on what issues come up, and we set up streams for the different topics. And I thought when we began talking about the show that I'd have a chance to look at every stream, but I have been head down in the Canada Proud stuff, and boy, this is a multi-layer spam and Velveeta sandwich served up here, and that's I think it shows a lot of the features. There's a real serious effort there to plant something. So I think I can chime in and help maybe with some of the technical background for Jess and for Caroline, but that's been where my eye has been for the last day and a half.
All righty. We definitely have a lot in separate environments that come together, which, is the common factor in this disruption machine. But the other thing that's at the bottom of the show page that I wanted to get out there and up front right now is NetWar Systems has been seeing an ever-increasing demand for their services to decipher what big data is doing, and that means expansion is necessary, and it's very obvious that there's no dark money sources funding NetWar Systems. So to purchase more hardware and to increase your ability to take on contracts and do work for people who are interested in knowing what's going on, not just what the messaging is, you guys have set up a GoFundMe. What would you like to tell us about that and what its purpose is?
I think I'm probably in the best position to describe what's going on there. We've been, the software we're using is something that I started in August of 2013. And it has gone through a wide variety of revisions over that time. And we found our first paying opportunity with it with the anti-Brexit guys in the UK, with James Patrick and Mike Galsworthy. And from that, we got some systems and a little bit of storage, and it gave us a place to start building. And the situation we face is that when you're doing this kind of big data stuff, your ship is always sinking. You're always taking on more. And the key is that, can you bail fast enough to not go under? And so right now we have 26 terabytes of storage, and that's we're a little over half full with 2/3 of a billion tweets. But that's going quick because we've picked up more stuff to do, and basically what we're concerned about is that we will crowd out kind of the public interest stuff. We have obviously the NGO type things like with the anti-Brexit guys, and we have a little bit of commercial work that we get. But the most important stuff that we do is working with reporters. We've got things, in the open with Caroline. And then I think in the GoFundMe, it mentions that we've done stuff with Mother Jones and Daily Beast and McClatchy and Bloomberg. I think there's probably a couple others if we went back and looked. But those are kind of the key players. And we, it's just vital. If we can stick a wrench in something before an election, before a referendum, before something that is utter nonsense becomes conventional wisdom, that's important. So by having the additional room to run, it'll give us a chance to do more than just Twitter and to hold on to stuff for longer in case we need to look back to see how things evolved.
Well, I absolutely agree with that concept, because the thing that I've noticed is there is no shortage of after the fact people finding out about how specific political campaigns or things like Brexit have been compromised. But that's after the fact. And I think it's very important for someone to be able to do a more real-time assessment of what is coming. And I think that's how the global disruption machine has stayed ahead of the game, because, they know what they're doing. Other people have to find out. So, I'm all for anything that supports more real-time investigation and analysis. There is a hyperlink on the bottom of the show page for the GoFundMe for NetWar Systems, but it's simple as hell, so I can say it on air and people can understand it. Is GoFundMe.com/F/data-for-democracy. So, now where exactly do we want to start in what has been going on in Canada? Are the earliest indications that the global disruption machine was here, are the earliest indications indeed through data? Is that the case?
I think Trudeau must go may be a good way to merge some of these things. So we looked at the hashtag Trudeau must go using the tools provided by NetWar System. That was back earlier this summer. That was a story I did for National Observer. And that hashtag, at the time we looked at it, was the #1 trending hashtag in Canada. We very quickly found evidence of what I call inorganic activity. So that doesn't necessarily mean bots. It just means not natural. So some of it was likely automated. Other was spamming. People were using tweets that just wrote Trudeau must go 10 times just to push the hashtag and get attention. But it was I think it was a good example of how a small number of actors can really hijack a hashtag and a narrative, because that did make its way then into the news cycle, reporting on, people are expressing their displeasure and their anger towards Trudeau, which is true for some of the people using that hashtag, but it was also a lot of sock puppet accounts, which are not real accounts. It's made to look like more people are tweeting about something and like more people have that opinion than actually do, like a manufactured consensus is what it's called. But so we looked at that early this summer, and it was really for Canada, which has a smaller presence on Twitter. Proportionally speaking, Twitter in Canada is just not as widely used as it is in the U.S. It's not quite as much part of the news cycle as it is in the U.S. So especially by Canadian standards, that was a very dominant hashtag. It was number one in Canada, and we were able to look at it really in real time and do a story on it very quickly in National Observer to kind of tell people, this is what you're looking at. At least a good chunk of what you are seeing is synthetic. It's not natural. It's people who are intentionally trying to push this hashtag using, again, bots, using sock puppets, using spamming techniques. I think that does show sort of how the media and social media and political parties, that hashtag got picked up by some of, not ready to drop names yet, because I would like to look into that a little more before I start dropping names, but it was part of some political groups started picking it up and pushing it. So, how those various vectors come together and, again, sort of hijack a narrative to create an impression that is not necessarily aligned with reality.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, from my vector viewpoint, we saw people like Seb Gorka. We saw people like Viktor Orban, people who are of a certain identifiable political position. Fascism is not really an overstatement, but these people suddenly were in the discourse over this hashtag and lending their support or quote-unquote reputation to the cause. And I see that as something that's new to Canada. I mean, I can't remember previously when some issue going on here was worthy of global social media name account promotion. I think that's something that's really changed. And Neil, what did you see from the analytics side on this?
Well, nothing Canadian specific that I'll get into at this point, but having spent the spring digging in the UK, it doesn't have to be a majority of the traffic. What we found is that around 5%, if you get 5% synthetic traffic and 5% synthetic accounts involved in a discussion, that they can drag it any direction they want it to go. And some of that is, suppressing opinions they don't like, and some of it is bumping opinions that they do. And we can't prove yet, but we think that there's a transient aspect to it, and that some of these outsider opinions, some of these individuals that get boosted, there may be a pile-on of automated accounts initially that makes the likes and RTs click. And then as actual organic humans get caught up in it, they start backing their stuff out. Can't prove that yet, but we keep suspecting that we're seeing that.
Is that done through a micro-targeting process that they make sure that what they want people to run with is put specifically in front of the crowd that they think will run the best?
I don't know about the targeting as far as the message. For me, it's those two counters at the bottom, and what are people doing to pump it? Who's involved in a given message? And if we can demonstrate that we've got these accounts out there that, they're bleached bot accounts from wherever, that, they're 6 years old and they've got 2 tweets, and the fact that they've got 2 is only because Twitter's API isn't perfect and they couldn't get the last bit of it removed. And they pop up and help to stand things up and then fade away before they can get noticed. So that is a generalized method that would be employed with anything that they might want to push. I have had, as I said, had my head down the Canada Proud rabbit hole, and I was not aware that there's any collusion there as far as Trudeau must go. I started, on Caroline's tip, we started streaming Canada Proud, and we found something that was obviously a machine at work. And we looked at those counts, the accounts involved, and there's just some eye-popping, this is not natural. This is calculated kind of stuff. And then I looked at the actual, the people involved in that stream versus the people following actual MPs. And I found, there are a bunch of accounts that don't follow MPs that got mentioned. And I'm trying to figure out what's going on there. I found, was sent a list of their writing associations. And for the Americans listening, that's like the precincts. That's the local canvassing kind of things. And that looks unnatural. And then I got their candidate list. And there, it's just, this should be a coherent mass if it's a legitimate political party, and it's a put together. It's a 4-door sedan, and every door is a different color, so far as I can see.
My first experience working with National Observer and using that war to kind of see what's going on was with the hashtag climate change discussion, and worked with Caroline and with the data we had collected to see how this hashtag was almost hijacked by these groups of botnets or sock puppet accounts, and how that's a popular strategy in taking these viral campaigns and kind of leeching on them to influence the conversation and get more of those people aligned with that political ideology on that side of the opinion or view, or in this case, disinformation.
For those who may not know, if we have some U.S. listeners tuning in who may not be familiar with what Canada Proud is, Canada Proud started as Ontario Proud back in 2016. It was founded as a Facebook page originally, and it was associated with Doug Ford back then. And then the sort of success, it's a right-leaning, right-wing political advocacy group. It's registered as a third-party advertiser in Canada, and most of their stuff is a very digital campaign. Most of the stuff that they do is online. They produce videos and ads that are, generally supportive of right-wing candidates, and much of their stuff has it's a very American feel, but in Canada, so it's very loud. It's more negative than a lot of other advertising, and a lot of it, as opposed to being supportive of right-wing candidates, a lot of it is attacking left-leaning candidates. So one of the big themes that has always existed with Canada Proud, whether it was one of the newer branches, is they're very antagonistic towards Trudeau. So now Canada Proud what started as Ontario Proud has now turned into Canada Proud, and there are other local branches in different areas of Canada. And it has, I think, probably had a larger impact within the digital ecosystem than maybe we give it credit for. And that's one of the things that I think Neil and I and Jess will be looking into with some of this new data that Neil was just talking about, to see sort of if we can quantify some of that impact.
Well, gee, where have I heard of this sort of thing happening before? That, an umbrella group or a organization pops up, gets registered. Nobody's allowed to know where their contributions are actually coming from, despite what they claim. And it's not a support of our guys. It's merely those guys suck. That's their entire modus operandi. Gee, this kind of sounds like butthurt emails to me. Anybody else see that?
Donors Trust is an organization in, let's say it's Arlington, Virginia, and they have a gobs of money, and it's utterly opaque, and they fund these little hit groups like you described, and they set them up, they run them for about a year, they file a couple extensions on their taxes so that they can't be called to account in the moment, and then they wind them up, and you see the same names pop up over and over and over again. And I know someone in DC who had a couple hundred I-990 forms, and that's the IRS form where the donors get reported. And they were literally doing the conspiracy wall, only it was too big. So it was basically the living room and dining room floor and like sticky notes, tagging names and stuff, trying to figure out what was going on. And like we've said earlier, the methods stay the same and the cast of characters the same, but the storefront changes.
I'll jump in real quickly on that and just I wrote an article, another one for National Observer, about third-party groups. So that's what, again, Canada Proud and Ontario Proud and the rest of the Prouds are registered as a third-party group. And I think that umbrella of registering as a third party, this is what I wrote an article about on a series of anti-immigration billboards put up by a third-party group supportive of the People's Party of Canada. And the third parties appear to be increasingly playing the role of or allowing an influence of sort of dark money, kind of letting a group or a political party candidate put out a message and avoid the potential backlash associated with certain messages. So again, if we're talking about groups using negative things that aren't necessarily in line with Canadian values and are different than what a lot of Canadians are used to in terms of political advertising and political campaigning. This particular instance that I'm talking about was an anti-immigrant series of billboards with anti-immigrant and anti-immigration messaging, and it allowed People's Party to have that message out there but not take responsibility, avoid accountability for the backlash. And there was backlash, so much so that the billboards ended up coming down. With these third-party groups, it was interesting. In this example, the group that paid for the ads actually said that they didn't approve the ads, which I don't see how that's possible, but essentially they were bringing in a fourth party and saying that it was another party that had approved of the ads and designed the ads, and they were just the medium. And I think in Canada, there's no such thing as Citizens United in Canada, but there is an option to register as a third party, and that's increasingly becoming a way for outside groups to basically collude with political parties, and these outside groups fund and in some ways take the hit for this negative advertising while allowing the major political parties to just sort of wash their hands and walk away.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that that's a factor. I mean, you bring up Citizens United, and, I'll just remind everybody that when former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, before he returned to politics, when he was president of the National Citizens Coalition, he went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada to basically get Citizens United legalized in Canada before it was legalized in the U.S. And the Supreme Court told them to stuff it, and that was the first of many, many losses before the Supreme Court for Stephen Harper and his ideology. But as far as looking at Canadian politicians habitually supporting bunk claims and bunk studies, I mean, most Canadian Twitter users will be familiar with people like Michelle Rempel, Pierre Poilievre, Aaron O'Toole, Peter Kent, many of the conservative senators, Linda Frum, Denise Batters, Leo Housakos, all of them, they all use the same sources, but they are not legitimate sources. The Fraser Institute pops to mind immediately. The Macdonald Laurier Institute pops to mind. Friends of Science, quote unquote, which is a well-funded climate denial organization. Politically, this cooperation has been going on for a decade in Canada, but what I'm seeing now is a very, very increased level of cooperation and making it look much more natural when in fact it is not. Now, Neil, Jess, are you seeing anything that backs that up?
That it's dark money activities, the hand behind the curtain?
Yeah, just that there are so many more debatable sources that are being promoted by so many different politicians. It just seems that this method of misinformation has become much more widespread. It used to be just basically Conservative Party in Canada would do this consistently, but now we're seeing it from all parties in this campaign.
I was U.S.-centric until the start of this year. And the parliamentary system is different in that here in the U.S. we would have, we have special interest groups, a CR Club, for example, that, they're legitimate GuideStar listed charities. And what I'm told with the Parliament is that if you have an issue that's hot enough, you may get a splinter party that's specifically based on that issue and the geographic nexus. And the use of the disinformation, I think, it's an evolutionary thing in that if the other guys are doing it and making out doing it, that it may not be mindful on the part of politicians. It may not be a collective decision, but like bacteria trade genes, it's the same thing going on. So you have these grassroots operations and they see what the other guys are doing and they're like, well, if they can get away with it, we better do something to counter it. So the tone may be different based on principle. And, I don't know the nature of that in Canada because you've really got more of isn't it sort of a tripolar system? You've got the Tories, the NDP, and the Liberals.
Yes, those are the three traditional parties, yes.
Yeah, so you've got a already admitted multipolar kind of thing. And here in the U.S., we really have sort of 5 constituencies, but they get split up the middle, lumped under these 2, equal-sized banners. So the qualitative as to who's saying what about who is not something that I often climb up to that level. I'm, more about the collecting the volumes of data and the metadata on the particulars of who's involved. And so it's unusual that I would get to the point where I would actually know all that much about a given issue, even if I've gone off and, chased down 10 million tweets and a bunch of people involved talking about it. I think it's really important when people start looking at this stuff to understand that this is, it may seem like a conspiracy. There may be actual conspiracies, and sort of the magnet for that kind of stuff is Cambridge Analytica. But this sort of thing is a network threat. And the fact that Cambridge Analytica was the biggest one of the operators, the most audacious, should not be taken to mean, or should not be interpreted, that they are the only player that does that kind of stuff. So, you say that it's, different groups learning. I think that's absolutely key, and that you need to, when looking at these activities, be more mindful of the methods employed, and the timeline, how they do things, the tactics, techniques, and procedures they use, and less concerned with where it's coming from. Because if you pay attention to the activity, that will match up better with other activities, or perhaps it'll be an evolution of a prior activity, and you get that fingerprint, and that is what leads you to who's driving it, as much as the cui bono approach of who at the top level would have wanted this.
It seems more opaque, but more present. It's just kind of like a background volume, not necessarily one speaker being turned up loud. And you talked about the common sources if you get to the end of the line. Caroline, what can you say about what you found in your reporting, that a lot of things eventually lead back to the same spot? Is there something we can say on that?
Sure. So I think a good example of this is, looking at some of the far-right media ecosystem, and I'll use one example of rebel media and some of the people associated with that. You look at again, if we're going across all of the vectors that we've been talking about, you have rebel media, and one of the founders of rebel media also happens to be now the campaign director for the Conservatives. And then rebel media has crossover with several media organizations, including True North, which is a newer platform. And again, in the media ecosystem, you tend to see as one group either loses credibility or takes on too much of a partisan nature, you see new groups and often see a lot of overlap between them, but these new groups sort of pop up and are used to, like we were talking about with the third party, sort of avoid responsibility maybe or accountability by presenting themselves as more nonpartisan or just put a new face on the same thing, basically. I think you see a lot of that with some of these new media organizations like Post Millennial, which is a newer platform in Canada that really interestingly, that one started as more partisan and has now tried to move more into the mainstream, trying to take on a face of more legitimate journalism, but when you look at it, a lot of the narratives, they jumped on the anti-Antifa bandwagon, and, a lot of the narratives are still the same as these hyper-partisan right-wing sites, but they're trying to put a nonpartisan, legitimate face on it. Going back to rebel media, I think you see some of that going on as well with organizations like True North, which, again, there's a lot of crossover with people and with narratives with rebel media, but because rebel media has sort of taken on a certain impression among Canadians, it's hard to put something on rebel media and have it presented as nonpartisan or as legitimate journalism. So you have organizations like True North that then sort of carry the water for a little while until it's passed along to the next new guy.
Okay, well, this brings up something to have a little exploration about. Now, as Caroline said, the identities of the sources seem to change, presented as a new voice or a fresh voice. But that's looking at the source. Now, Neil, what you said, when you look at the content, is that the way to get around what the new sticker on the door is? when it's the same people behind the door? Are you finding by using your tools, you're seeing that even if these quote-unquote sources are new or making a new presence, the messaging is the same? Can you see that in what you're doing?
Well, there's a lot more ugly detail underneath. So I'm going to give you some anecdotes from other environments. There was in the UK this thing called Leave Alliance, and it popped up out of the blue seemingly and got a lot of press, and consumed 2 news cycles and distracted people from the whole what are we going to do about Brexit, and then it kind of faded away. A preliminary investigation, you would have found that there's an existing Leave Alliance thing, and it is a legitimate grassroots group. And what made it to the press was not what they intended. It was just their name got basically lifted to do that work. And we had, several 100,000 tweets, but we could scroll back to the very beginning. Time-wise, you can see that it rises rapidly, and there was no reason. And at the head of that, it looked like it looked like a chat room to me. This, in retrospect, this is my impression. It looked like a chat room at about 9 p.m. evening time in the UK. That the chat room was all excited and ready to go, and something was going to happen. And there were a couple false starts. One at like 9:15, 9:25. And then 2 programmatic tweets go out at 9:30, and then it's off to the races. And so we looked at the account that did the programmatic tweets. And in that case, the application being used was a broadly employed. It's not ideological. It's not used by a specific group. And but the guy that was running it, there was enough data in there that we could kind of track backwards, and he got made. So it was a Welsh communications consultant who apparently was the ringleader on this thing, who organized it with a group of his Twitter people, and planted it and made it go. And I don't know that he'll be doing that again, because we marked him up pretty good.
So is that one of the big tools that the disruption machine uses, as long as they keep the volume up and keep the minutiae changing quick enough? Are they confident that nobody's going to stop and say, hey, wait a minute, where is this stuff coming from? Is that a key part of their strategy?
Well, in terms of these disinformation outlets, they establish a rhythm, like the drummer for the band, like the bass player. That's the tempo. And so they're always going to have stuff, and people are coming there, and some of it's decent. So, it's actual legitimate journalistic work. And then if there's something that they need to plant, they've already got the eyeballs. They've got the attention. And so they can plant the outrage of the day, and people are already present. As far as what I just described, if you go to DC and you have, legit grassroots organizing capabilities, you know how to round up volunteers and manage them and get stuff done, and you talk to the people out there who have anything grassroots in their offering, what that means is synthetic grassroots. Nobody puts AstroTurf on a business card, but it is understood within inside the Beltway that someone saying grassroots, what they mean is they'll put up a slick website that can't be attributed, and the posts will have 1 to 2 spelling errors each, because that's how things are with grassroots activists. And there's some people around that can run these things that kind of make it look like it might be an actual group of people. And it plants the idea, and they pay for ad campaigns, so it turns up on Facebook and on Twitter and wherever else. That's your human push behind things.
Well, I think we're establishing a pattern here, definitely, and it's demonstrable and provable that part of the technique is to keep the focus on the noise, not the noise maker, there are certain issues that have come up in this Canadian election that have never been prominent before. Number one among them is climate change. All polling across Canada, no matter political stripe, it seems to be an accepted fact of life, a reality, that climate change is real. But yet we're not really seeing the political parties react to it without jeopardizing their platform or their traditional dogma on that subject. And it's affected the way, I don't know if it's being controlled or if it's being downplayed or it's just not getting picked up to become a reflection of the actual opinions of people. Jess, I know you've been looking at this from the analytics side. Are you seeing, like, which way is winning? Who's pushing, who's pulling on climate change in the Canadian election?
Well, that's a great question, Glenn. And from what I've seen is a big push from the Liberal and the Green Party talking about climate change and having that discussion. But I've had a crash course into Canadian politics and how the members of parliament split up, and the Conservative Party of Canada versus the People's Party of Canada. And when it comes to climate change, one of the dashboards I have, I'm looking at right now, it's filtered by Climate Change Week. So from September 20th to it ended on the 27th, we're seeing the Conservative Party almost not even discuss bringing up climate change. They're talking about this green tax that's helping homeowners, but for the most part, it seems they're shying away from it. But that changes with Maxime Bernier seems to be the lead in that conversation on the Conservative side. But from my understanding, they're not a part of the Conservative Party. They're a part of the People's Party of Canada. So we're seeing that individual really lead the discussion from the right perspective on climate change and being critical of it to the point that he may even be a denier. So Caroline and I worked on a story where we were able to see them really hit into that hashtag climate change conversation on Twitter using their very popular base. Some of the tweets we see is their tweets get as many retweets as Justin Trudeau and Andrew Scheer, another popular Twitter conservative Canadian. And it's interesting to see how, for the most part, conservatives aren't even bringing this up.
There are enough of us in the environment in Canada, we can say, well, we know exactly why they're not bringing it up, because they don't want to do anything about it. I mean, the platforms have finally come out on climate. Scheer talked for over a year about how fantastic his plan would be, but yet any sort of critical review of the Conservative climate action plan is do nothing and blame it on the rest of the world. So that's nothing new. I think the way they're trying to sell it is new. I think that's a little bit of recognition that the environment has changed on this subject. It's no longer an outlier. It's no longer a niche topic. Everybody is aware of it. So do you think that by the Liberals and the Greens pushing this, are they doing it for their own benefit to sell their own program, or are they doing it to show people that the Conservatives have got nothing? Or is it a combination?
In my opinion, I would think it's a conversation. I know it's a popular topic. It's hitting home with a lot of people who are afraid what their future is going to look like. And I think politicians inherently kind of take advantage of those, paranoias and fears of people and use them to further their agenda and to get elected. And given the way it's becoming such a polarizing topic, which is just blows my mind, it seems so scientific and logical, like we should do something to avoid climate disaster. But with the more conservative side of Canada not voicing any opinions or viewpoints on this, it's really opening it up for the Liberals to dominate it. And could that be a strategy from the right to make people see the right as someone more, or the left as maybe more frantic? It could be. I think it all really depends on where the person's coming from. I think given their views, they're going to have what I'm trying to say is if people on the right aren't hearing about climate change from their politicians and they only have the left, is that going to push them to inherently want to not believe that side, thinking that, they're doing it for their own political reasons, not for the well-being of everybody.
Yes, the old popular whataboutism and the deflection, the projection that no, we're not doing that, they're doing that. And, history has shown what a common tactic that is.
One of the big things that's happened this year, this has been sort of I've been the lone gun analyst for the longest time. And when Jess turned up and she got interested in dashboards right away, that was a huge relief to me, because I can build things or I can go out and do analysis, but that's two different mindsets for me, and I can't switch it during the day. And then to do the presentation work that she does, that's like another thing for me. So to have someone else that's their first thing, is that they start, laying out these kind of dashboards, that's a big deal. Elasticsearch, which gives us basically the ability to build our own search engines, like our own private Google, and it gives us a lot more control over what we see, in particular in time slicing. And so we have an initial kind of discovery area where we just get raw text and we can poke at it and see what's going on. Then we can build visualizations, and those are things like it's very common for us to show date histograms of account creation. So we have a button we click that will lay out if we get a set of accounts that we've collected data from. It'll create a chart from the beginning of 2006 through the most recent day. And that is, if you look at those things side by side, you can tell sometimes where automation pops up. And we can do pie charts. So we did pie charts on physical location that people admit to in their configuration. And then there's other things you can look at with Twitter accounts. For example, you can pick up on accounts that are created and abandoned, because people tend to get in and they take the suggestions, who to follow, and they'll accept it once, and that gives them 20 accounts that they're following, more or less. Or they'll do it twice, and they'll have 40. And so there are a lot of accounts out there that have either 20 or 40 friends and no tweets, and that's an indication. It's a quick visual on what abandoned accounts are. And we just started doing this. We suddenly had an influx of people who, they wanted their dashboards. They wanted, we have a couple different wire rooms, and people wanted to see aspects of the collection, and it's questions that I never would have personally fielded in the past. So that's been a big step forward. It's a big deal.
Caroline, is it time for you to bring in the media side of climate? Because of course, National Observer is more active than many other mainstream sources, and of course there's also stuff like the Narwhal and other people who are focused on it. Is it time for you to jump in and tell us what your angle is on media and climate and the acceptance or the deniability of that coverage?
Sure, I can speak to that for a minute. So climate change, like many other issues, has become relatively partisan in nature in Canada, just like it is in the U.S., even though Canada tends to be a little bit attenuated compared to the U.S. media environment in terms of that partisan nature isn't quite as much on the surface in Canada on some of it. Tend to have a little bit less outright denial and more denial on some of the solutions, more agreement that climate science is actually real, but there's less agreement on is it caused by humans. So in Canada, you see a more obvious influence of oil and gas money in the media in Canada than you do in the U.S. Not that it's not happening in the U.S., but it's more obvious in Canada. You have founder of Rebel Media, who also wrote a book called Ethical Oil that quite literally argues that the morally and socially correct thing to do is to produce more oil in Canada, mine drill for more oil. And so you see a lot of that influence of oil money in Canadian media environment. And I think there's also some American influence, and that gets into American oil money influence in the Canadian media ecosystem. And I think that also gets into the general Americanization of the media ecosystem in Canada, which has been pretty apparent this cycle. Getting into some of the specific issues on climate-related media coverage, Jeff started to talk about one of the pieces I wrote for National Observer, just sort of looking at what's the hashtag climate change discussion in Canada. You know, what does it look like? Who's dominating it? What are the issues people are discussing? We found that the conversation was very much dominated by a few very loud voices. And again, this is limited to the hashtag, not the entire climate change discussion, as people who are using the hashtag climate change on Twitter. And it was limited to a sample of people who were either following or tagging Canadian MPs. So it was a Canada-specific climate change discussion on Twitter. The People's Party and Bernier were really dominating the discussion, and a lot of it was limited to a single issue. It was right around when Bernier was criticizing Greta Thunberg, and we looked at months of data, but the top 10 tweets, something like 5 of them were on that single issue of Maxime Bernier criticizing Greta Thunberg, going after her for being young and, not being able to present her ideas clearly enough. Again, she was speaking in a language that wasn't her own. A young girl doing something that a lot of us wouldn't be able to do as adults. His criticism was the topic of a lot of discussion, I guess you could say. People were not exactly happy to see an adult male attacking a young girl who is, doing something that she believes in. Looking at that climate change discussion, it really got hijacked by that one issue. And when you look at it as part of a larger picture, that's the kind of thing that doesn't necessarily look intentional when you focus and narrow down on that one instance. But when you look at it as part of a pattern, it starts to look like it is intentional, and that sort of ability to hijack a discussion. Anytime you're talking about a politician attacking a young girl, you're not talking about climate change. You're not talking about solutions to climate change. You're not talking about the politicians and parties and interest groups who deny climate change. For climate change deniers, anytime you're not talking about climate science and the effects of climate change, it's success. So even though the discussion was, not necessarily positive in terms of people were angry at Bernier, in the bigger picture, it was still a success. I think another thing this brings up is how climate change and issues related to climate change sort of merge with other social issues in Canada and other groups in Canada. So I'll give you one specific example, which is the Yellow Vest. The Yellow Vest movement, the original Yellow Vest movement, started in France. It really started in Canada as a far-right movement. The Yellow Vest movement is all about oil and gas. In Canada, it's all about using oil and gas as a means to sort of avail for things like Islamophobia, anti-immigrant viewpoints. And so you see also climate change sort of being used as a vehicle to either hide or as a medium to convey other points of view, other political viewpoints that, maybe people don't want to come right out and say that they are an anti-immigrant group. So they say they're interested in oil and gas issues and use that to push anti-immigrant viewpoints.
Well, I think that's a very good point. This misdirection from what the actual discussion is about is not necessarily something new. But what I've noticed the last few years is when refocus, quote unquote, is happening on a subject, it's done alarmingly fast and alarmingly across the board. It's not like it used to be where one person wants to redirect and then they have to build their consensus to do that. What I've been seeing lately is all of a sudden it's almost like it's predetermined, like there was some discussion elsewhere. And then all of a sudden, an entire lineup of people who hold a different viewpoint all start pushing the same dead cat issue. I find that very interesting. When you look at the data side of things, can you see evidence of things like that to completely change the channel despite it being the same program?
I think that what has happened, we have, polarization on social media, and we have self-reinforcing bubbles. But even at an academic level, if you look at INSNA, the International Network for Social Network Analysis, so it's a very academic sort of group, and there are all sorts of discussions about cross-platform correlation. Twitter's, instead of point-to-point DMs, there are now group DMs. So there's a lot of stuff that used to go on kind of, out in the open or within a specific hashtag that went hidden in those group DMs, and, people talk it out till they've got what they want, and they're trying to make it first. So that's facilitated that kind of stuff. And then, we see with extremists that there's a lot of stuff where, they've got Discord and they're tracking things. And there are other platforms where, the conversation on the message creation happens. And then Twitter is really the place where it gets set loose. It's a field for performance art, and you only see the finished performance, not the rehearsal.
I guess that's the advantage of the ability to network, I guess related to the stealth factor that I mentioned in the show description. Is there a way to fight that at all?
Well, as I mentioned, there's academic research in that area. And certainly what we see with, for the benefit of the listeners, right now we're talking about, elections and special interests and disinformation type stuff. But there's a chunk of our work that has to do with extremist groups. And what we've seen there is that, for example, there's stuff that plays out on Twitter, but a lot of it forms up on Telegram in advance. And if you're not in Telegram, you're missing all but the peaks. You've got this sort of digital crab bucket, and every once in a while something will get out and get into general discussion. But if you're not looking in there, you don't see who's involved and what the underlying issues are, how things come to pass. You and I have experienced that too over the years. 6 or 8 years ago, it all originated on a certain set of IRC channels, and then it would spill over into the public. And Telegram, so it's gone mobile instead of IRC, which is primarily a desktop computer nerd kind of thing. Now it's Telegram groups, and I think that a lot of it probably happens on WhatsApp, but that's not popular with extremists, so I don't know all that much about it.
Well, I find that very interesting that the bad things will never stop happening, but they certainly keep evolving. They keep advancing to more streamlined methods, more secure methods. The game will keep going whether the field gets changed or not. The question I have is, why are the dark forces always ahead of those who are interested in transparency, interested in full disclosure? I mean, this is for the data vector and for the media vector. Is there a reluctance to look into source instead of message? Or is it a tactic? Or does it simply work better for revenue if sometimes you just don't ask questions, you just run with the story? Caroline, what do you think the synergy is there? Is it cooperation? Is it ignore it? Or is it, hey, we can make money on this?
That's a good question. Yeah, I can't speak broadly on that, but I can speak to some, patterns that I've seen and seen people discussing. I would say, part of it is the fact that those who are probably most interested in that are more traditional journalists, and right now is a very hard time to be working in that space. Journalism industry is struggling right now. with few resources, the huge influx of bad information being pushed in by interest groups, whether it's information being pushed by bad actors, whether it's influence operations. Journalists have more information to deal with right now than ever before and fewer resources to do it. I think probably some of it is just a matter of time, resources, money, and the people who are most interested in doing it may not be equipped to do it, while those who have the most money are the least interested. So I think that probably explains some of it. I think probably another factor is there are then media organizations that do have relationships with groups or the topics that they are covering. So, for example, if we go back to climate change, I think you would find that a fair number of media organizations have ties to oil and gas groups or other interest groups that are influencing whether or not they chase down a source or really get to the bottom of a story, or whether they just take the information and sort of do what they're told. So again, though, I think a lot of it is probably honestly a matter of resources and just having more information, much of which is bad information, but just having so much to sort through and little time to do it. And we're operating in a very competitive media environment. A lot of times journalists have people coming to them. It's a matter of figuring out which of those people is beholden to some interest group and coming to the journalist to convey their message, or which of them is actually, coming with a legitimate story. So there's a lot of stuff to work with and very few resources to do it.
The great big macro issues here, I think you look at income inequality, and a lot of these things happen because unions are emaciated. And it used to be that a bunch of this stuff that we're seeing, that there would be, a couple of union guys and they'd have a couple bankers' boxes of documents. And if some of this silliness got started, they would go out and take care of it. And that's gone. That's, that kind of research, the budget for that is slipping away. We've had the democratization of media, with the formation of the netroots after the 2004 election, and then the rise of social media, which makes everything much faster and much more accessible, because now it's always on, it's always in your pocket. You have a smartphone, so that's in effect. And another thing that's gone on that I think doesn't get as much attention as maybe it needs to is the democratization of intelligence. That now you can be a guy sitting in a bedroom somewhere in California, and if you get a little equipment together and have the sense of what to do, you can start a intelligence collection operation. And there are offensive capabilities that have leaked because people started kicking over some of the contractors. First being HB Gary, and then since then we've seen Ben Fisher got tagged, and hacking team in Italy, and a couple others, and those tools are out there.
Well, we've talked some, and we're going to talk more about the presentation of these efforts, regardless of side. And I would even venture that it's not necessarily the presentation to elevate. There's also presentations underway to discourage and silence. Now, I think, Jess, this speaks a little bit directly to what you're involved with your education and what you're working towards. Is this part of the good fit that Neil describes with your ability to do work on the presentation and to make it explainable to bigger numbers? And is it part of your environment to simply try and change the message to something that people can understand? Is that giving you an advantage when you start to put pieces of the puzzle together and make it relatable for everyone?
Yes, I would say with my education, I've kind of reverse engineered my master's. Meeting with Neil prior to enrolling in my master's degree, he was able to fit my thirst for data with his programming abilities and some of my Python scripting skills. We were able to collect a large amount of Twitter data, and enrolling in my master's, which is focusing on international development and technology's role in that. My specific focus is with conflict areas and how social media comes at play, has been able to give me a bunch of data. But in a way that's been kind of confusing, cart before the horse, and learning as I go research methods and being able to question this data in an academic way and not making assumptions has been the biggest takeaway. My initial interest that brought me into data mining was bots, and seeing that in the US election and how that influenced opinions and how easy it was to, mine that data and then look for the repeats and find those bots. So being able to take these data streams we're doing, in specific with Canada or the US, is taking those fundamental skills of what are we visualizing? Is it a descriptive statistic? And using the quantitative methods to rationally take out this data and being able to communicate what it means and trying to check my assumptions along the way. People are not all people, but I've seen a lot of activity on social media where some people jump to the conclusion, you're a bot if it's someone they disagree with, and really trying to determine if an account is a bot is hard because it is based on assumptions. Does this account have a description? Are they using an obscure source? And trying to say, what can we say is a fact here? Is this thing being manipulated? Are people spreading disinformation, which is more clear versus is this account real or not? And trying to answer questions, but also open up on the areas we really don't know and we can't say 100%. And that's where it really ties in with academia and, what is an ultimate truth versus the many different perspectives at play.
As far as, bringing in different viewpoints, it kind of echoes what happened in 2010. I don't know if we'd met then, but that was sort of how Progressive Congress News really took off. It had a couple people who did the backbone and understood how it worked. And then some other people said, hey, wait a minute, we can do this, that, and the other. And Jess has brought that diversity. I have much more programming experience than her, but several times now she's gone and, she dips her toe into a certain pool and comes back with, one page of stuff and says, look at this. And it leads me in a whole new direction. She has that talent of, noticing where something is blocking and finding the thing that breaks down that barrier.
For listeners, they should be starting to understand the different perspective and the different work that NetWar Systems is doing. And it, that brings me to what your GoFundMe to grow your operation is titled, and that is Data for Democracy. And, that's really what impresses me. You guys aren't joining the industry to get in on this money pie. You guys are more concerned about actually finding out what the hell's going on here instead of just joining the game and making out like bandits. So, that's fantastic. But we've mentioned that word here already, bots. Now, like I said in the show description, NetWar Systems has detection tools, and they've proven very effective to this point in different social media spheres. What can you tell us about what you've been able to find? Do you see patterns? And do you see commonality in, I don't know if it's source or funding or whatever else, but there's a lot of miscommunication and hearsay about bots and botnets. And because it's so hard for the average person to understand, Jess, what can you tell us about what NetWar has been finding out about bots out there?
Yes, I felt NetWar has been a fantastic tool in being able to visualize activity on Twitter, and given my past experience researching bots, looking for things such as source code or time analysis, something that would have taken me, reading a lot about SQL and trying to build charts from graph has been, exponentially cut with using Kibana, which is an Elasticsearch, which so easily integrate, and just picking a couple areas and graphing them. It takes me minutes, if not seconds, to do, which it could have taken me hours prior. And the time versus the effectiveness of these charts and the diversity of what we're able to choose from building bar charts to look at histogram and time distribution of tweets has been an effective technique in looking for bots, and digging in on the source code using things like TweetDeck and other kind of obscure sources to push out a narrative all at the same time. Like some of these, as Neil said earlier, aren't apps that are just used within one community. If this, then that is a popular automation tool for pushing out different stories. But that is another tool that is popular within disinformation campaigns and botnets, and being able to find these leads and these characteristics that we're learning bots have, and then use those to dive deep on specific narratives to see if we can find that same activity, populating a hashtag, for instance. And Network System has definitely made that so much easier. And these open source tools are available to anyone, and I hope down the road people can use these to find out things for themselves. And like you said, we're not in this to get rich and dip out, but more give people the knowledge of knowing what's going on in the social media environment. It's turned into an information war zone, in my opinion, and giving people the tools to not only come to their own conclusions about political narratives without being fed false information, but being able to find out what these structures look like, these disinformation structures, whether they're botnets or, coordinated group of foreign soldiers trying to influence a topic, being able to see behind the curtain and understand what's going on to maybe a deeper level than they could before.
It's been an evolving environment. And when we first built some bots back in 2009, they were very much a public service kind of thing. That, we set them up to be pseudo-random, and we gave them a little bit of different text to use, and they were, announcing campaign events and things like that. And they were set to run, every hour or two. And it's because of the Federal Election Commission, we would register an app that was the name of the campaign that pointed to the campaign site. So it was pretty transparent, and it was, served the same function as the little, pin board inside the entryway of the supermarket when you go in. And it became weaponized. And then Twitter, there's a huge bot bulge that starts kind of at the fall of 2015. And then Twitter bought Smite in May and June of 2018. And there's a precipitous drop in those automated accounts. But it should not be seen that the bots are gone. Twitter purged 143,000 nonsense spewing applications and took out those bots. They purged a lot of accounts that just, were obviously misbehaving. But they can't get it all. They can't, because some of them are pretty good at looking human. And it's bad for them in a market perspective, because that's going backward on their key performance indicator, which is the number of people using the system. The other thing that we've seen, the sources, being able to use a source to identify where the bad activity is coming from, it shifted from automated programming, it raised the cost, and now I think there are a lot of those Chinese phone farms that are involved, where, there's open source software you can get to drive an Android to have it do stuff. And, there's a lot of ad fraud stuff. That's where it's been developed, but it's used for these political campaigns. And people in the U.S. are starting to do that. And I don't know as much about it as I probably should. One of the strong points that we have, we've taken this data center oriented machine indexing piece of software, and we started doing streaming with Twitter. That was something that Jess went out and did the initial research and brought me a page and a half of code, and now it's our primary offering. And one of the benefits we have is that we didn't get the Twitter fire hose. If we had a fire hose, we would have everything that Twitter does. And since we haven't come at it that way, we've had facets of the conversation. And what we're finding is the fact that we have to facet has been a constraint on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's been enormously helpful, because any facet that we have is because somebody said, hey, what's going on with Trudeau must go? Or, hey, these 6 accounts are up to something. Can you look at their network and see what's going on? So that is something that I have not seen another system that lets you do that. And that's a benefit. And I would add that one of the things I think that's happening here is there's going to be a fission of the system. We released source code. Everything that we do is out there on GitHub. And there is a conflict-oriented application to the system that there's another group of people that use that. I'm not entirely sure what they do with it. And I think this data for democracy thing that Jess has just come up with is that's going to be key. I think that's going to continue. And part of the disinformation stuff that works is if you're a human, you have a limited amount of time, you have a mobile device in your pocket. And so you have this tiny window, both in terms of time and in terms of screen real estate, to try and understand what's going on. And you can get rolled. But a person equipped with a 4K monitor and a system that never sleeps and records everything, you can grab an entire set. I've got nearly 400,000 tweets here in front of me that came from Canada Proud, and I can see when it started and ended. And I just look at this time curve and I'm saying, that's a machine, that's not human. But you, as a lone Canadian out there, armed with nothing more than your Android with a cracked screen, taken in by something like that. So this releasing this software, and I'm kind of hoping that what we see is that there will be university courses focused on disinformation that will take this kind of tool and use it. And I think that newsrooms absolutely would benefit from having someone who, their job is to stand watch over the key accounts in their area, and if they have something trending, to look at it and figure out if there's been a disinformation campaign. To build the system is a task, but to learn to run it, it's not so bad. It's, we provide some support, and once we get 3 or 4 of these things out there, I think it'll get some momentum, and you'll start to see that it won't just be National Observer and Mother Jones that have this kind of stuff going on. You'll see it spread to other newsrooms.
Well, I think that opens up the natural next thing here. I mean, as you mentioned, National Observer has exposure to your methods and your tools. Caroline, you've worked a lot of places in media. What difference are you seeing that this ability gives National Observer? Like, if it's used at the right point in time, does this influence everything from how much money is spent pursuing a particular avenue to being able to determine quicker whether something is even worth pursuing? Like, is there a definite advantage for media to be involved using these tools to diffuse goose chases before they even start?
So I think, going back to the first thing we talked about, going back to the Trudeau must go hashtag, the ability to look at that in real time and to write about it and give, real-time analysis and commentary is something that a lot of newsrooms don't have right now, and or are not necessarily even aware exists, or not sure how to do it. The ability to do that quickly. I think gives any newsroom an advantage, and something that certainly we're still figuring out how to maximize that, because it really, besides the advantages for the newsroom, it gives an advantage to the public, because if something like Trudeau Must Go is trending, the public should know about it. It should know what's behind it. Should have the ability to see sort of maybe what others don't want to be seen, and that's a big advantage, I think, of using these tools, is that it gives you the ability to uncover things that people didn't plan on being uncovered, and things that normally wouldn't get published. And in terms of how this influences the media ecosystem, there are the purpose of bots, the purpose of a lot of orchestrated campaigns like that is to do things covertly, so that people aren't aware of how things are getting pushed into the mainstream. So if you have 1,000 bots pushing something, and the bots are all run, or sock puppets, whatever type of accounts, if you have 1,000 that are all controlled by just a few people, the purpose is to have everybody, all the observers, not realizing that really it's just a few people pushing it, and to make it look like it's larger, or that a consensus has been reached on something where there is no consensus. And the ability to pick that apart in a way that is digestible, and that an untrained eye can actually understand, that's really kind of what journalism is all about, is uncovering things and showing them to the public in a way that they can understand, in order to help them make more informed decisions, so they're not making decisions based on a misperception or misunderstanding of the issue.
Okay, this brings me to Caroline. You've worked so many places, had different employers, different environments. What Neil's talking about with the ability for National Observer to have these tools at their disposal, how many times do you see the competition in the media world not having that advantage and getting led down the garden path? How much stuff comes out where you can sit there and go, wow, these guys are getting taken for a ride because they don't have the ability to see what we see? Have you experienced that?
Yeah, well, it happened with the Trudeau Must Go stuff, in that a lot of people sort of took that at face value and didn't realize, necessarily what they were looking at. And I mean, honestly, I would say a good proportion of stuff that is picked up on social media and then covered in traditional media, the same thing. People aren't sure what they're looking at. It gets covered, again, at face value. And, it's not necessarily even, I wouldn't even call it bad journalism. It's just, if you don't have the tools to dig into it, which a lot of newsrooms don't, you get taken for a ride, and may never, honestly, in some instances, you may never even realize it unless somebody comes along with the tools to report on it.
Well, this must cause a little bit of question, because, I mean, you're finding value in NetWar's tools. I'm sure the National Observer is finding value in them. All these other outlets with all this money, why aren't they finding value in them? Is there a reason behind that, in your opinion?
I think a lot of times they're not even aware or that it exists. And I think in other instances, people social media moves fast. And, journalism moves fast too, but social media moves faster. And I think a lot of it is a matter of not necessarily being aware of what you should be looking for and when you should be looking for it.
Well, I think there's also an issue of corporate focus. I've been saying for so long, revenue rules the roost with mass media. So, I would have to question whether their desire for fullness, for the big picture, is even there when there's an opportunity to keep that revenue rolling. So, that's a whole nother issue. But I imagine it's quite entertaining for one outlet to see another outlet being led down the garden path, and it's like, oh, well, you guys have fun. We know what's happening over here. But then it must also be frustrating when the wrong story gets more exposure than the right story. Is that happening more and more?
Yes. Well, the whole issue with bots that we were just talking about, one of the purposes of them really is to get, a certain issue into the media more than it might otherwise. And I've absolutely seen, many instances where, for example, if we look at the Trudeau brownface story, that one got a lot of coverage right around the time the Yellow Vest Exposed and Anti-Racism Canada blog released a list of all the members of the Canadian Nazi Party. And guess which issue got more coverage, and guess which issue hardly got any coverage. So, I think that's a perfect example of, a major story that got very much overlooked because of a splash of a scandal.
Well, there you have it. That was all the time we had. A little difficult to get 4 people in 4 different physical locations around North America to all get together and have a 2-hour discussion. Everybody had things to do. But that's the show for tonight. I would like to thank behavioral scientist and independent journalist Caroline Orr, currently writing for National Observer, covering Canadian election 43. I'd also like to thank being representatives of NetWar Systems, Neil Rauhauser, and Jocelyn Hernandez. And of course, I will now take this opportunity to remind everyone of the hyperlink at the bottom of the show page. That is for the GoFundMe to assist NetWar Systems to expand their capacity of not only data, but their capacity of taking on work for clients. They're not asking for the world, and it's quite laid out exactly what they would like to do with anything you can spare for them. GoFundMe.com/F/data-for-democracy. Please consider it. They do excellent work. It's quite a system, a lot of tools. It's bringing results. And in my opinion, National Observer may one day say it's the best money they ever spent. So we looked at the vectors. Caroline gave us the media perspective. Neil and Jess gave us the big data perspective. The one we covered the least was mine. Isn't that funny how that works out? The political collusion. Take a look at the slideshow. There's pictures there. But remember, when you see your provincial premier saying how terrible everything is in Ottawa, were they saying that maybe when there was a different prime minister? Were they saying that when maybe it was a different party? Is there anything to what they're saying, or are they just helping out their team? All things to consider. One more show before the election. It will be on a Wednesday. Imagine that. That show will be with the all-time guest appearance leader, Mr. Stephen Lawtons. I believe his tentative title is something along the lines of Canada's post-truth election. We'll see you back on Wednesday for that show. Otherwise, that's it for tonight. Thank you for listening to The View Up Here, 2 days late or not. Good night.